The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence's house as Camilla Parker Bowles stood at the window of her private sitting room, watching the groundskeepers tend to the roses. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held her morning tea, the delicate china cup rattling against its saucer. The newspapers scattered across her mahogany desk told a story she wished she could rewrite, their headlines screaming accusations and judgments about her family that cut deeper than any personal attack ever could. Charles had been unusually quiet at breakfast, his jaw set in that familiar way that meant difficult decisions were brewing behind his thoughtful eyes. After 30 years of knowing him, first as a friend, then as something more complicated, and finally, as his wife, Camilla had learned to read the subtle signs of his internal struggles. The way he folded his newspaper with precise, sharp creases. The manner in which he stirred his coffee counterclockwise exactly 7 times. The heavy silence that settled around him like a protective barrier when the weight of duty pressed too heavily on his shoulders. The latest scandal involving her son Tom and daughter Laura had been building for weeks, each revelation more damaging than the last. What had started as whispers in society circles had exploded into front-page news when photographs surfaced of Tom at an exclusive gambling establishment, reportedly losing substantial sums that raised questions about the source of his funding. Laura's involvement with a controversial art dealer who was now under investigation for money laundering had only added fuel to an already raging fire. Camilla set down her teacup and moved to her writing desk, where a stack of personal letters awaited her attention. Among them was one from her sister Annabelle, written in the familiar flowing script that had comforted her through countless childhood scrapes and adult crises. Annabelle's words were carefully chosen, diplomatic even, but the underlying message was clear. The family was closing ranks, and they expected Camilla to use her influence to protect them from the growing media storm. The irony was not lost on her. For years, she had been the target of public scrutiny and criticism, particularly during the difficult period following Diana's death, when every appearance, every gesture, every choice of clothing was dissected and judged. She had learned to develop a thick skin, to smile graciously in the face of hostility, and to carry herself with dignity even when the world seemed determined to tear her down. Now, the tables had turned, and it was her family facing the harsh glare of public judgment. Charles entered the room without knocking, a habit that spoke to the comfortable intimacy they had developed over the years. His expression was grave, and she knew instinctively that the conversation they had both been dreading was about to begin. He moved to stand beside her at the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture she recognized from countless official photographs. "The Prime Minister called this morning," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant duty. "The party leadership is concerned about the potential impact on the monarchy's reputation. There are questions being raised in Parliament, and the opposition is demanding a full investigation into any potential conflicts of interest." Camilla felt her heart sink, though she had been expecting this moment. The machinery of constitutional monarchy was precise and unforgiving, with little tolerance for scandal that might undermine public confidence in the institution. She had always understood that marrying Charles meant accepting certain limitations and responsibilities, but she had hoped that her children, as adults with their own lives and careers, might be allowed to exist somewhat outside the rigid constraints of royal protocol. "What are they asking for?" she inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Charles turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret that made her chest tighten with apprehension. "Complete separation," he said simply. "No contact, no financial support, no public acknowledgement of relationship. They want a clear line drawn between the crown and any potential liability." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence, heavy and immovable. Camilla felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet, the same feeling she had experienced when her first marriage ended, when the news of her relationship with Charles first became public, when she had stood at the altar in Windsor Guildhall knowing that half the world was watching and judging her worthiness to become part of the royal family. "Tom and Laura," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The two people who had given her life meaning long before she ever imagined she might one day be queen consort. Her children, who had stood by her through the darkest periods of public vilification, who had defended her when others attacked, who had grown up in the shadow of one of the most scrutinized relationships in modern history. Charles moved closer, his hand reaching out to touch her arm in a gesture of comfort that felt both natural and impossibly inadequate. I've spoken with my advisors, he continued, his voice carefully controlled. There might be ways to manage this quietly, to allow for private contact while maintaining public distance. But it would require absolute discretion, and any future incidents would make the situation impossible to contain. Camilla closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. She thought of Tom as a little boy, always getting into mischief but quick to offer a gap-toothed smile and sincere apology when caught. She remembered Laura's teenage years, the long conversations about boys and dreams and the future, the way her daughter had fiercely defended her mother's relationship with Charles even when it cost her friendships and social standing. The sound of voices in the corridor outside reminded her that they were not alone in their private tragedy. Staff members were going about their daily routines, preparing for the numerous appointments and engagements that filled every royal schedule. Somewhere in the building, private secretaries were crafting statements and managing communication strategies designed to protect the monarchy from association with scandal. The vast machinery of royal life continued its relentless operation, indifferent to the human cost of its efficiency. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "The announcement needs to be made by the end of the week," Charles replied, "before the next round of parliamentary questions. 5 days. 5 days to choose between the family that had shaped her into the woman she was and the institution that had given her life purpose and meaning in ways she could never have imagined. 5 days to decide whether love for her children outweighed duty to her country and husband." Camilla moved away from the window, walking slowly around the room that had become her sanctuary within the larger world of royal residences. The walls were decorated with personal photographs and artwork that told the story of her life. Images of her children at various ages, paintings from local artists she had championed through her charitable work, books that had provided comfort during difficult times. Each item represented a piece of herself that she had been allowed to preserve despite the overwhelming demands of royal protocol. She paused before a photograph taken at Laura's wedding, a joyful image that captured a moment of pure happiness before the weight of current circumstances had descended upon them. Tom stood beside his sister, both of them smiling with genuine warmth and affection. The innocence of that moment now seemed almost heartbreaking in its simplicity. "They're good people," she said softly, her voice barely audible even in the quiet room. "They've made mistakes, but they're not criminals. They don't deserve to be treated as pariahs because of who their mother chose to marry." Charles joined her beside the photograph, his presence both comforting and complicated. "I know," he said simply, "but the institution is bigger than any of us. Sometimes it demands sacrifices that seem impossible to make." The conversation was interrupted by a discreet knock on the door, followed by the entrance of Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, whose expression suggested he carried news that would further complicate an already difficult situation. He approached with the careful deference that characterized all interactions within the royal household, but his urgency was unmistakable. "Your Majesties," he began, using the formal address that still sounded strange to Camilla's ears. "I'm afraid there have been further developments. The evening papers are preparing to run additional stories about Master Tom's business associates, and there are suggestions of connections to individuals who are currently under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office." Camilla felt the room spin slightly, her hand reaching out instinctively to steady herself against the back of a nearby chair. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated, moving beyond the realm of manageable scandal into territory that could pose genuine threats to the stability of the crown. Charles's face hardened, the transformation from loving husband to constitutional monarch happening with a swiftness that never failed to surprise her. "What exactly are they alleging?" he asked, his tone crisp and businesslike. "The details are still emerging," Sir Clive replied carefully. "But there are questions about several property transactions and offshore accounts. Nothing has been proven, but the mere suggestion of impropriety could be extremely damaging, particularly given the current economic climate and public sentiment about wealth inequality." The implications were clear without being explicitly stated. The British public, already struggling with rising costs of living and economic uncertainty, would not look kindly on any suggestion that members of the royal family, even by marriage, were engaged in questionable financial dealings. The contrast between the privileged lifestyle of the monarchy and the daily struggles of ordinary citizens was a perpetual source of tension, one that required careful management under the best of circumstances. Camilla sank into her chair, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of forces beyond her control. She had always prided herself on being practical and resilient, qualities that had served her well during the long years of public criticism and personal attacks. But this situation felt different, more serious, with the potential to cause lasting damage not just to her own reputation, but to the institution she had sworn to serve. The afternoon stretched ahead with a series of previously scheduled engagements: a visit to a local charity, a reception for Commonwealth representatives, a private dinner with parliamentary leaders. Each event would require her to maintain the careful composure that was expected of someone in her position, to smile and make appropriate conversation while her personal world crumbled around the edges. As Sir Clive departed to manage the developing crisis, Charles returned to stand beside her chair. His hand rested gently on her shoulder, a gesture of support that spoke volumes about the depth of their partnership despite the institutional constraints that governed their lives. "We'll find a way through this," he said quietly. "We always do." But even as he spoke the words, Camilla could hear the uncertainty beneath his confident tone. This was uncharted territory for both of them, a situation that tested not just their personal relationship, but their understanding of what it meant to serve the crown in an age of unprecedented media scrutiny and public accountability. The evening light was beginning to fade outside the windows of Clarence's house, casting the room in the soft golden glow that had always been one of her favorite times of day. Soon, she would need to prepare for the dinner engagement, to transform herself into the public figure that the world expected to see: gracious, composed, untroubled by personal concerns. But, for now, in this moment of quiet before the storm, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was being asked of her. The choice between family and duty was as old as monarchy itself, but knowing that others had faced similar decisions did little to ease the pain of her own circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new tests of her resolve and commitment. But, tonight, she would hold on to the memory of her children's faces, the sound of their laughter, the warmth of their embraces, storing these precious moments against the possibility that they might soon become nothing more than cherished recollections of a life that duty would no longer permit her to claim. The secure telephone line in Charles's private study carried the weight of constitutional crisis as he listened to the Prime Minister's measured words. 3 days had passed since the initial conversation with Camilla about her family's situation, and the political pressure had intensified beyond anything either of them had anticipated. The morning briefings now included detailed assessments of public opinion polls, media monitoring reports, and strategic communications plans designed to protect the monarchy from association with scandal. Camilla sat in the drawing room of Highgrove House, their beloved Gloucestershire retreat, surrounded by the garden catalogues and correspondence that normally brought her such pleasure. The pastoral setting, with its carefully tended organic gardens and centuries-old stone walls, had always provided sanctuary from the pressures of public life. Today, however, even the peaceful countryside could not ease the growing anxiety that had settled in her chest like a physical weight. The morning newspapers were spread across the antique oak table, their headlines growing more sensational with each passing day. "Royal scandal deepens," proclaimed the Daily Mail, while the Times offered a more measured but equally damaging analysis titled "Constitutional Questions Arise Over Royal Family Connections." The Guardian had published an editorial questioning whether the monarchy could maintain public confidence while appearing to shelter family members from legitimate investigation. Her mobile phone buzzed constantly with calls from Tom and Laura, their voices tight with worry and confusion as they struggled to understand how their personal difficulties had escalated into a constitutional crisis. Tom's voice had cracked with emotion during their last conversation, when he'd asked whether marrying into the royal family meant his mother could no longer acknowledge him as her son. "Mummy, I don't understand what's happening," Laura had whispered during a late-night call, her voice carrying the same vulnerability it had held when she was a frightened child seeking comfort after a nightmare. "The reporters won't leave us alone. They're following the children to school. James is asking why Granny can't visit anymore." The reference to her grandchildren had been like a knife to Camilla's heart. The thought of little James and Gus growing up believing their grandmother had abandoned them was almost unbearable. These innocent children, who had brought such joy to her life, were now casualties in a battle they could never understand. Charles emerged from his study looking older than she had seen him in years, the strain of recent days evident in the new lines around his eyes, and the way his shoulders carried themselves with resigned determination. He crossed the room slowly, settling beside her on the chintz-covered sofa that had witnessed countless private conversations throughout their marriage. "The cabinet met this morning," he said without preamble. "The Attorney General has confirmed that there will be a formal investigation into Tom's business dealings. The Serious Fraud Office has opened a file, and there are suggestions that parliamentary questions will be raised about any potential use of royal connections for commercial advantage." Camilla felt her breath catch in her throat. A formal investigation meant that the situation had moved beyond the realm of media speculation into the territory of legal proceedings. The implications for the monarchy were staggering, particularly given the current government's precarious position and the opposition's eagerness to exploit any perceived weakness or impropriety. "What about Laura?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "The art dealer investigation includes a review of all recent transactions and business relationships," Charles replied carefully. "Her name appears in several documents that are now part of the official inquiry." The words settled between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond their immediate circle. Camilla understood the unspoken message. Her children were no longer simply facing embarrassing publicity, but potential criminal charges that could implicate the crown itself. She rose from the sofa and walked to the window overlooking the walled garden where Charles had spent countless hours pursuing his passion for organic farming and environmental conservation. The sight of the carefully tended vegetable plots and herb gardens normally filled her with a sense of peace and continuity, connecting her to the simple pleasures that had sustained the royal family through centuries of public service. Today, however, the view only emphasized how far removed her current reality had become from the natural rhythms of ordinary life. While other grandmothers were free to worry about school performances and birthday parties, she was trapped in a web of constitutional protocol and political calculation that seemed to grow more complex with each passing hour. "The private secretary wants to schedule a meeting with the palace communications team," Charles continued, his voice carefully neutral. "They need to prepare a statement that distances the crown from any potential legal proceedings while maintaining appropriate dignity and discretion." Translation: they needed to craft language that would effectively disown her children without appearing heartless or vindictive. The statement would be parsed by constitutional experts, analyzed by political commentators, and scrutinized by a public already skeptical about the relevance and cost of the monarchy in modern Britain. Camilla thought about the careful choreography that governed every aspect of royal life, the way even the most personal decisions were filtered through layers of advisors, protocol experts, and political considerations. She had learned to navigate this complex world over the years, developing an instinct for the unspoken rules and expectations that shaped royal behavior. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the possibility that she might be forced to choose between her children and her duties as queen consort. The very idea seemed to contradict everything she had believed about the balance between personal and public life that she and Charles had worked so carefully to maintain. Her phone rang again, the caller ID showing her sister Annabelle's name. She let it go to voicemail, unable to face another conversation about family loyalty and the expectations that came with her position. The voicemails from various family members had been accumulating for days, each one representing another relationship strained by the impossible circumstances that had enveloped them all. The afternoon brought a visit from Sir Clive Alderton and the palace's senior legal advisor, their presence in the informal setting of Highgrove creating an atmosphere of surreal formality. They spread documents across the dining room table, transforming the space where she and Charles shared quiet meals into a crisis management center. "The legal position is complex," the advisor explained, his tone professionally neutral despite the gravity of the subject matter. "While there is no suggestion of direct royal involvement in any questionable activities, the mere association could be damaging to the crown's reputation and constitutional position." Camilla studied the documents they had prepared, draft statements that reduced her children to private individuals whose conduct does not reflect the values or standards of the royal family. The language was carefully crafted to create maximum distance while avoiding explicit condemnation, but the effect was the same: public repudiation of her own flesh and blood. "What if we simply maintain silence?" she suggested. "Refuse to comment on private family matters?" Sir Clive shook his head gravely. "The political situation won't permit that luxury, Your Majesty. The opposition has already given notice of parliamentary questions specifically designed to force a response. Silence would be interpreted as either guilt or arrogance. neither of which serves the crown's interests. The conversation continued for hours, exploring various strategies and potential outcomes. But each option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. Her children would have to be sacrificed to protect the institution she had sworn to serve. The choice was presented as both inevitable and necessary, couched in language about duty and constitutional responsibility that made opposition seem not just futile but selfish. As evening approached, Charles walked with her through the gardens that had become one of his greatest sources of pride and personal satisfaction. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the last roses of the season provided splashes of color against the gathering twilight. "I spoke with William earlier," he said as they paused beside the sundial that marked the garden's center. "He wanted me to know that he supports whatever decision we make, but he's concerned about the precedent this might set for his own children." The mention of William brought another dimension to the crisis that Camilla had been trying not to consider. The future of the monarchy depended on public confidence in the next generation of royals, and any suggestion that family loyalty might compromise constitutional duty could have implications far beyond their current circumstances. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That we would handle the situation in a way that protects the institution while maintaining our personal integrity," Charles replied. "But I'm not sure those two goals are compatible in this case." They walked in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of the choice they were facing. The gardens around them represented years of careful planning and patient cultivation, a testament to the belief that beautiful things could be created through dedication and sustained effort over time. The parallel to their own relationship was inescapable. They had worked for decades to build a marriage that honored both their personal commitment and their public responsibilities. Now they were being asked to demonstrate that institutional loyalty trumped family bonds, that the crown's reputation mattered more than a mother's love for her children. "I keep thinking about Diana," Camilla said quietly as they approached the house. "About how fiercely she protected William and Harry, even when it created difficulties for the palace." Charles stopped walking, his expression troubled by the reference to his first wife. The comparison was painful but apt. Diana had consistently prioritized her role as a mother over her duties as a royal, often to the consternation of palace advisors who preferred more traditional approaches to balancing family and constitutional responsibilities. "Diana had the luxury of being divorced from the institution," he replied carefully. "Her actions affected her own reputation, but didn't threaten the constitutional position of the crown." The difference was crucial and heartbreaking. Diana's fierce protectiveness of her sons had been seen as admirable, even when it caused embarrassment to the royal family. But Camilla's position as queen consort meant that her family relationships were viewed through the lens of constitutional implications rather than maternal instinct. Back inside Highgrove, they found another stack of messages waiting: calls from journalists seeking comment, requests for interviews from television producers, and formal communications from various government departments outlining the legal and political ramifications of the developing situation. One message stood out from the others: a handwritten note from the Queen Mother's former private secretary, now in his 80s but still sharp in his understanding of royal protocol and constitutional history. His words were few but pointed. "Remember that the crown has survived many storms by knowing when to sacrifice the part for the whole." The reference to historical precedent was both comforting and devastating. The monarchy had indeed survived countless challenges over the centuries, often by making difficult choices that prioritized institutional stability over personal preferences. But knowing that others had faced similar decisions did little to ease the weight of her own circumstances. That night, as Charles worked late in his study preparing for the next day's meetings with government officials, Camilla sat alone in their bedroom, surrounded by family photographs that told the story of her life before the crown claimed her. Images of Tom and Laura as children, graduation pictures, wedding photos, candid shots of family holidays, and quiet celebrations. Each photograph represented a moment of pure joy and maternal pride that no constitutional crisis could diminish or erase. But they also served as painful reminders of what she was being asked to give up in service to an institution that demanded absolute loyalty and unwavering commitment to its preservation. The decision that had seemed impossibly difficult days earlier was beginning to crystallize into grim inevitability, shaped by forces beyond her control and considerations that transcended personal preferences. Tomorrow would bring another round of meetings and discussions, but the outcome was becoming increasingly clear. The crown would survive, as it always had, by demanding sacrifices from those who served it. And she would discover whether a mother's love could withstand the inexorable pressure of constitutional duty. The morning of the decision dawned gray and cold over London, matching the somber mood that had settled over Buckingham Palace like a heavy shroud. Camilla stood before her dressing room mirror, mechanically applying the makeup that would help her face what promised to be one of the most difficult days of her life. Her reflection showed the toll that recent events had taken, new lines around her eyes, a tightness to her mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible choices. The red box containing the final draft of the palace statement sat on her writing desk like an accusation, its royal cipher gleaming gold against the morning light. Inside were documents that would formally sever her public connection to Tom and Laura, creating an official distance that felt like tearing away pieces of her own heart. Charles had left early for a series of meetings with constitutional experts and government ministers, the weight of kingship evident in every line of his face as he'd kissed her goodbye. The formality of his departure, attended by private secretaries and protection officers, had emphasized the institutional nature of the crisis they faced. This was no longer simply a family matter, but an affair of state requiring the full machinery of constitutional monarchy to resolve. At precisely 9 o'clock, Sir Clive Alderton arrived with the final version of the statement, accompanied by the palace's senior communications advisor and a representative from the Attorney General's office. Their presence transformed her private sitting room into an impromptu council chamber where the fate of her family would be formally decided. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional necessity, "we need your approval for the release of this statement to the press. The timing has been coordinated with Downing Street to ensure maximum effectiveness in containing the political fallout." Camilla accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts at composure. The language was precise and unforgiving, crafted by experts in constitutional law and media management to create absolute separation between the crown and any hint of impropriety. "Her Majesty the Queen Consort wishes to make clear that the recent allegations concerning members of her extended family are matters for the appropriate authorities to investigate. The royal family maintains no involvement in, or responsibility for, the private business dealings of individuals who, while related by family ties, operate entirely independently of the crown and its interests." The words continued, each sentence driving the wedge deeper between institutional necessity and maternal love. References to private individuals, independent actors, and separate spheres of responsibility reduced Tom and Laura to strangers whose only connection to her was an unfortunate accident of birth that must not be allowed to compromise the monarchy's reputation. "The legal team has reviewed every word," the Attorney General's representative explained. "This language provides maximum protection against any suggestion of royal involvement while maintaining appropriate constitutional distance." Protection, distance, constitutional necessity. The vocabulary of statecraft transformed human relationships into matters of legal strategy and political calculation. Camilla understood that she was witnessing the machinery of monarchy in action, watching centuries of institutional survival instincts override the natural bonds of family and love. "What happens after we release this?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would bring little comfort. "All official contact ceases immediately," Sir Clive replied with professional detachment. "No public appearances together, no acknowledgement of relationship in official contexts, no access to royal events or residences. The separation must be absolute and sustained to be credible." Absolute and sustained. The words echoed in her mind like a funeral dirge, marking the death of relationships that had given her life meaning long before she'd ever imagined becoming queen consort. She thought of Tom's childhood fear of thunderstorms, how he'd crept into her bed during nighttime storms seeking comfort and protection. She remembered Laura's first heartbreak, the way her teenage daughter had sobbed in her arms while rain drummed against the windows of their Wiltshire home. The communications advisor spread additional documents across the table, media monitoring reports showing the explosive growth of public interest in the story, parliamentary schedules indicating when questions about royal accountability would be raised, and polling data revealing declining confidence in the monarchy's ability to maintain ethical standards. "Public opinion is shifting rapidly," the advisor explained, pointing to charts and graphs that reduced human suffering to statistical trends. "We have perhaps 48 hours before this becomes a full-scale constitutional crisis. The opposition has called for emergency debates, and There are suggestions that Republican groups are planning to exploit the situation. Republican groups. The specter of anti-monarchist sentiment hung over the conversation like a sword of Damocles, threatening not just her own position, but the entire institution that Charles had spent his life preparing to lead. The arithmetic was brutal in its simplicity, her children's freedom versus the crown's survival. The telephone rang with characteristic discretion, its muted tone barely disturbing the heavy atmosphere of the room. Sir Clive answered with practiced efficiency, his expression growing more grave as he listened to the caller. "That was the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police," he announced after ending the call. "The investigation has been expanded to include potential charges of money laundering and conspiracy to defraud. They're requesting formal interviews with both Tom and Laura within the week." Criminal charges. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming what had been a matter of public relations into something far more serious and irreversible. Camilla felt the room spinning slightly, her vision blurring as the full implications of the announcement registered in her consciousness. Money laundering. Conspiracy to defraud. These were not minor indiscretions or social embarrassments, but serious criminal allegations that could result in prison sentences and permanent disgrace. The investigation had moved beyond the realm of media speculation into the territory of actual legal jeopardy. "How long have we known about this development?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The information became available to us this morning," Sir Clive replied carefully. "The police wished to coordinate their announcement with our statement to minimize confusion and ensure proper constitutional separation." Coordination. Even the timing of criminal investigations was now subject to the needs of royal public relations. Camilla realized that she was not simply witnessing the machinery of monarchy, but experiencing its full power to shape events according to institutional requirements. Her mobile phone buzzed with an incoming call from Tom, the third attempt he'd made that morning to reach her. She stared at his name on the screen, knowing that answering would only make the coming separation more painful, while recognizing that this might be her last opportunity to speak with him before the official silence began. "I need a moment alone," she said, rising from her chair with as much dignity as she could manage. The officials exchanged glances but respected her request, filing out of the room with the discretion that characterized all interactions within the royal household. Camilla waited until their footsteps faded before answering Tom's call, her heart breaking at the sound of his voice. "Mummy, what's happening?" he asked, his words tumbling over each other in panic and confusion. "The lawyers are saying things I don't understand, and Laura's in bits. The children are asking questions we don't know how to answer." She closed her eyes, fighting back tears that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "Tom, darling, I need you to listen very carefully. Things are going to change, and I need you to trust that everything I'm about to do is to protect you and your sister." "Protect us from what? We haven't done anything wrong. These are just business complications that got blown out of proportion." The innocence in his voice was heartbreaking. Tom genuinely didn't understand how his minor indiscretions had escalated into a constitutional crisis, couldn't comprehend the forces that had been set in motion by his association with questionable business partners. In his mind, these were simply unfortunate misunderstandings that could be resolved through proper legal representation and patient explanation. "Sometimes being right isn't enough," she said softly. "Sometimes appearances matter more than reality, and perception becomes more important than truth. Are you saying you can't help us? That we're on our own?" The raw vulnerability in his question cut through her heart like a physical wound. Her son, the little boy who had once brought her dandelions and called them flowers, was asking whether his mother planned to abandon him in his moment of greatest need. "I'm saying that I love you more than life itself, and because I love you, I have to make choices that might not make sense right now but are necessary to protect what matters most." The conversation continued for several more minutes, each word feeling like a goodbye that neither of them was prepared to say. Laura called while she was still speaking with Tom, her voice thick with tears and incomprehension. The conversations blended together in her mind, a symphony of confusion and heartbreak that would haunt her for years to come. When the officials returned, they found her standing at the window overlooking the palace gardens, her composure restored but her eyes revealing the cost of maintaining royal dignity in the face of personal devastation. "The statement is ready for your final approval," Sir Clive announced, placing the documents before her with ceremonial precision. Camilla picked up her pen, the same fountain pen Charles had given her on their first wedding anniversary, engraved with her initials and a small crown that had once seemed like a symbol of achievement rather than burden. The weight of the instrument felt enormous as she prepared to sign away her right to publicly acknowledge her own children. "There is one additional matter," the Attorney General's representative interjected. "The investigation may require testimony about the extent of any financial support or assistance provided to the subjects. It would be helpful if we could establish a clear record of separation that predates any potential charges." Clear record of separation. They were asking her not just to disown her children publicly, but to deny any history of maternal support that might implicate the crown in their difficulties. The request went beyond institutional necessity into the territory of personal betrayal, demanding that she rewrite the history of her own motherhood to suit legal strategy. How far back would such a record need to extend? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Ideally, several years," came the reply. "Any recent financial transactions or assistance could be construed as evidence of ongoing support that might compromise the crown's position." Several years. They were asking her to pretend that she had been an absent mother, that the close relationship she'd maintained with Tom and Laura throughout their adult lives was a fiction that never existed. The magnitude of the deception required was staggering in its scope and cruelty. Charles entered the room at that moment, his expression showing the strain of his morning meetings with government officials. His presence brought both comfort and additional pressure, reminding her that this decision would affect not just her relationship with her children, but the future of the monarchy he had inherited. "The Prime Minister has called an emergency cabinet meeting for this afternoon," he announced without preamble. "There are suggestions that Parliament may demand a full investigation into royal finances and accountability mechanisms. The situation is moving beyond our ability to contain it quietly." Emergency cabinet meeting. Parliamentary investigation. The crisis had escalated beyond the realm of family dysfunction into the territory of constitutional review. The very foundations of the monarchy were now under scrutiny, and her children had become the catalyst for a broader examination of royal accountability and democratic oversight. Camilla looked at the statement awaiting her signature, understanding that this moment represented a point of no return. Once she approved the official separation, there would be no possibility of reconciliation without admitting that the entire crisis had been manufactured for political convenience. Her children would be permanently exiled from her public life, reduced to shameful secrets that must never be acknowledged. The pen felt impossibly heavy in her hand as she approached the moment of decision, knowing that her signature would forever change the definition of what it meant to be a mother, a wife, and a servant of the crown. The signature felt like signing her own death warrant, each letter of her name carved into the official document with the weight of institutional necessity behind it. Camilla set down the fountain pen with hands that had stopped trembling, not from restored confidence, but from the numb resignation that follows the acceptance of inevitable tragedy. The statement lay before her like a legal gravestone, marking the official death of relationships that had sustained her through decades of public scrutiny and personal challenge. Sir Clive Alderton immediately began the coordination process that would transform her private agony into public relations strategy. Within hours, the palace statement would be released simultaneously to major news outlets, coordinated with briefings from Downing Street, and carefully timed to minimize political fallout. The machinery of constitutional crisis management operated with ruthless efficiency, reducing human suffering to manageable communications challenges. Charles remained beside her as the officials departed, his presence both comforting and complicated by the role he had played in forcing this impossible choice. She understood that he faced his own constitutional constraints, that the crown demanded sacrifices from kings as well as queen consorts. But understanding the institutional logic did nothing to ease the pain of what they had just done to her children. "The BBC wants an exclusive interview," Charles said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of additional demands yet to be made. "They're offering a primetime slot that would allow us to control the narrative and demonstrate responsible leadership during a constitutional crisis." An exclusive interview. The thought of sitting before television cameras to explain why she had abandoned her own children filled her with revulsion and dread. The carefully crafted talking points would reduce Tom and Laura to abstract concepts of accountability and institutional necessity, erasing their humanity in service to political strategy. "What would they expect me to say?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be scripted by palace communications experts with no regard for maternal instinct or personal integrity. "That you support the rule of law, that the monarchy cannot be seen to interfere with proper legal processes, and that personal relationships must not compromise constitutional responsibilities, Charles replied, reciting words that clearly came from his morning briefings rather than his own heart. The phrases rolled off his tongue with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime translating human emotions into acceptable public statements. But Camilla could hear the strain beneath his composed delivery, the recognition that they were both trapped in roles that demanded the sacrifice of everything they held most dear. Her phone buzzed with messages from family members who had seen early reports about the palace statement. Her sister Annabelle's text was brief but devastating. "How could you?" followed by a string of messages from cousins, friends, and extended family expressing shock, disappointment, and incomprehension at her apparent betrayal of Tom and Laura. The messages kept coming throughout the afternoon as news of the separation spread through their social circle. Each notification brought another small wound, another relationship damaged by the impossible position she had been forced to occupy. People who had known her for decades struggled to understand how the woman who had fought so fiercely for her right to marry Charles could now abandon her own children to protect that same institution. The irony was not lost on her. For years, she had been criticized for prioritizing her relationship with Charles over other considerations, for putting personal happiness ahead of public opinion and traditional expectations. Now she was being forced to demonstrate the opposite priority, to show that institutional loyalty trumped even the most fundamental human bonds. The afternoon brought a visit from William, whose presence in the family crisis added another layer of constitutional complexity to an already impossible situation. As heir to the throne, his support for their decision carried enormous weight, but it also highlighted the generational implications of what they had done. "I wanted you to know that Catherine and I understand why this was necessary," he said, his words carefully chosen, but carrying genuine sympathy. "We're concerned about the precedent, but we recognize that you had no choice given the circumstances." The reference to precedent struck her like a physical blow. William was already thinking about how this crisis might affect his own children someday, whether George, Charlotte, and Louis might face similar demands to choose between family loyalty and constitutional duty. The thought that she might have helped establish a principle that could one day tear apart the next generation of the royal family was almost unbearable. "I hope they never have to understand," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you find a way to protect them from choices like this." William's expression showed his own recognition of the impossible position she faced. As a father himself, he understood the maternal instinct that made her sacrifice so painful. But, as a future king, he also recognized the institutional necessity that had made their decision inevitable. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of additional palace staff carrying briefing documents for the next phase of crisis management. The schedule for the coming weeks had been completely reorganized around the need to demonstrate royal stability and continuity despite the family upheaval. Engagement after engagement had been carefully choreographed to show Camilla in settings that emphasized her commitment to public service and royal duty. Hospital visits, charity receptions, and ceremonial functions would provide visual evidence of her unwavering dedication to the crown, each appearance designed to reinforce the message that institutional loyalty trumped personal considerations. "The communications team has prepared responses to likely questions," Sir Clive explained as he spread the documents across her desk. "The key messages focus on respect for legal processes, commitment to transparency, and the separation between personal and official responsibilities." Respect for legal processes. The phrase would be repeated in every interview, every statement, every public appearance until it became associated with her public persona. She would become known as the queen consort who chose duty over family, institutional loyalty over maternal love. The thought of Tom and Laura watching these performances filled her with shame and regret. They would see their mother standing before cameras, reciting carefully crafted explanations for why she could no longer acknowledge their existence. The choreographed displays of royal dignity would become daily reminders of their abandonment. Evening brought the first television reports about the palace statement, their carefully neutral language unable to disguise the magnitude of what had been announced. Royal correspondents struggled to find historical precedents for a reigning queen consort formally disowning her own children, their analysis revealing the unprecedented nature of the constitutional crisis they had all helped create. The television coverage included file footage of happier times, Tom and Laura at royal events, family photographs from before the current troubles, images of Camilla with her grandchildren that now carried the weight of lost relationships. The visual contrast between past intimacy and present separation provided a powerful narrative that would be repeated endlessly in the coming weeks. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from sympathy to outrage, with hashtags trending that revealed the polarized nature of public opinion about her decision. Supporters praised her constitutional responsibility and commitment to the rule of law, while critics condemned her as a heartless mother who had sacrificed her children for personal ambition. The competing narratives fought for dominance in the digital arena, each side marshaling evidence and arguments to support their interpretation of events. But, regardless of public opinion, the institutional machinery continued its relentless operation, transforming personal tragedy into constitutional precedent. That night, alone in her private quarters while Charles worked late on crisis management with his advisors, Camilla found herself surrounded by the physical reminders of her life as a mother. Photographs, letters, gifts from Tom, and Laura spanning decades of shared experiences now felt like artifacts from someone else's existence. A handwritten note from Tom, sent just weeks earlier to thank her for helping with his son's school fees, lay on her dressing table like an accusation. The innocent gratitude expressed in his familiar handwriting now represented the kind of financial support that constitutional lawyers deemed potentially compromising to the Crown's position. Laura's latest artwork, a small watercolor painting of Highgrove's garden sent as a surprise gift, hung on the wall beside formal portraits of royal ancestors. The juxtaposition emphasized the collision between institutional history and personal affection that had made their current situation inevitable. Sleep proved elusive as she replayed the day's events in her mind, searching for alternative choices that might have produced different outcomes. But every scenario led to the same conclusion. The institutional demands of monarchy left no room for the messy complications of family loyalty and maternal love. The morning would bring new challenges as the full implications of their decision became clear. Media interviews, parliamentary questions, and public appearances would all require her to defend choices that felt like betrayal while maintaining the dignified composure expected of someone in her position. But tonight, in the privacy of her grief, she allowed herself to mourn not just for Tom and Laura but for the woman she had been before the Crown claimed every aspect of her identity. The mother who had once believed that love and duty could coexist, who had imagined that institutional service might enhance rather than eclipse personal relationships. The transformation was complete. She had become what the monarchy required, a symbol of constitutional principle who placed institutional necessity above all other considerations. The cost of that transformation would be measured not in public approval ratings or political stability, but in the hollow spaces left by relationships that could never be recovered. Tomorrow would bring the first test of her ability to perform this new role, to stand before cameras and audiences while pretending that the sacrifice of her children had been a choice rather than a constitutional demand. The performance would need to be perfect, convincing, and sustained for as long as she remained queen consort. The Crown had survived another crisis by demanding the ultimate sacrifice from those who served it. And she had learned that there were no limits to what monarchy could require from those who wore its symbols and bore its responsibilities. The morning of the first public appearance after the separation dawned with deceptive beauty, autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of Buckingham Palace, as if the world had not fundamentally changed overnight. Camilla stood before her bedroom mirror, applying makeup with mechanical precision while her lady-in-waiting laid out the carefully chosen outfit that would signal appropriate gravity without suggesting personal distress. The schedule showed a visit to a children's hospital in East London, an engagement planned weeks earlier that now carried devastating irony. She would spend the day surrounded by other people's children, celebrating their recoveries and comforting their families, while her own maternal relationships lay in ruins beneath the weight of constitutional necessity. Her hands shook slightly as she fastened the sapphire brooch that had belonged to the late Queen Mother, its familiar weight providing small comfort amid the emotional devastation of recent days. Every piece of jewelry, every accessory had been chosen to convey messages about continuity, stability, and unwavering commitment to royal duty. The red boxes on her desk contained briefing notes about the hospital visit, but also updates on the continuing investigation into Tom and Laura's affairs. The police interviews had been conducted with ruthless efficiency, each session revealing new complications that justified the palace's decision to distance itself from potential criminal charges. Tom's business associates had been arrested on charges of fraud and money laundering, their activities spanning several countries, and involving millions of pounds in questionable transactions. Laura's art dealer had been charged with conspiracy and criminal deception, his gallery revealed as a front for an international network of financial crimes. The evidence painted her children as either willing participants in criminal enterprise or naive victims of sophisticated manipulation. Neither possibility offered comfort to a mother watching her family's destruction from behind the protective walls of constitutional immunity. Charles entered her private sitting room, carrying his own stack of briefing papers, his expression showing the strain of managing multiple crises simultaneously. The government's confidence in royal leadership was being tested daily, with opposition politicians demanding explanations for how such extensive criminal activity had gone unnoticed within the extended royal family. "The commissioner wants to brief us on the latest developments," he said, settling into the chair opposite her dressing table. "There are suggestions that the investigation may expand to include other members of your family's business network." Other members. The net was widening beyond Tom and Laura to encompass cousins, family friends, and business associates who had been drawn into the expanding web of criminal investigation. Each new arrest brought additional pressure to demonstrate that the royal family had maintained appropriate distance from questionable activities. "Have you spoken with them?" she asked, though she knew the answer. Official contact had been severed completely, leaving her dependent on news reports and police briefings for information about her own children's fate. "That wouldn't be appropriate under the circumstances," Charles replied gently. "Any contact could be misinterpreted as interference with legal processes or evidence of ongoing support." The word appropriate had taken on new meaning in recent days, becoming a euphemism for the institutional constraints that now governed every aspect of her behavior. What was appropriate served the Crown's interests rather than human relationships, legal strategy rather than maternal instinct. The drive through London to the hospital provided her first glimpse of public reaction to the separation announcement. Protesters had gathered outside the palace gates carrying signs demanding justice and accountability, their messages reflecting the polarized nature of public opinion about her decision. Some supporters held banners praising her constitutional responsibility, their words echoing the official talking points about duty and legal process. But others carried signs condemning her as a heartless mother who had abandoned her children for personal ambition, their anger reflecting a more complex understanding of the human cost involved. The hospital visit unfolded with scripted precision, each interaction carefully choreographed to demonstrate appropriate royal behavior while avoiding any situation that might invite uncomfortable questions. She moved through the wards with practiced grace, her smile never wavering despite the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm her composure. A young boy recovering from cancer treatment reminded her painfully of Tom at the same age, the same wide eyes and gap-toothed grin that had once made her heart swell with maternal pride. The child's mother spoke movingly about the strength required to face uncertainty and fear, unaware that her words were cutting through Camilla's carefully maintained facade like surgical instruments. "Your Majesty looks tired," the woman observed with the directness that only concerned mothers possessed. "I hope you're taking care of yourself during these difficult times." The kindness in her voice nearly broke Camilla's composure entirely. This stranger, dealing with her own family crisis, had noticed the strain that weeks of constitutional performance had failed to hide. The recognition of shared maternal experience created a moment of human connection that transcended the careful barriers of royal protocol. "Sometimes we all face choices that test everything we believe about ourselves," Camilla replied softly, her words carrying more honesty than any official statement had contained. The afternoon brought a reception for Commonwealth representatives, another event that required her to embody the dignity and stability expected of someone in her position. The diplomatic gathering provided a welcome contrast to the emotional intensity of the hospital visit, its formal conversations about trade and cultural exchange offering temporary refuge from personal anguish. But even in this carefully controlled environment, the impact of recent events was evident in the subtle changes in how people interacted with her. Conversations carried undertones of sympathy mixed with curiosity, each exchange revealing how thoroughly the separation announcement had penetrated public consciousness. A High Commissioner's wife approached her during the reception, her manner suggesting carefully considered words about the challenges of public life. "We all admire your strength during this difficult period," she said quietly. "It takes enormous courage to put duty before personal considerations." Courage. The word felt like mockery rather than praise. What they called courage felt like cowardice to her, the inability to resist institutional pressure that had forced her to abandon the people who mattered most. Real courage might have meant defying the crown's demands and accepting the consequences. The evening news coverage provided a brutal assessment of the day's events, royal correspondents analyzing her every gesture for signs of strain or uncertainty. The hospital visit was portrayed as evidence of her commitment to royal duties despite personal difficulties, while the reception was cited as proof of international confidence in her continued effectiveness. But the most devastating coverage focused on reactions from Tom and Laura themselves, their first public statements since the separation announcement. Speaking through their lawyers, they expressed bewilderment and heartbreak at their mother's decision, their words carefully crafted to avoid direct criticism while conveying profound sense of abandonment. "We continue to love and respect our mother despite the current circumstances," Tom's statement read. "We hope that family relationships can eventually be restored when these legal matters are resolved." The careful language couldn't disguise the pain beneath their formal words. Their hope for eventual reconciliation revealed how completely they had failed to understand the permanent nature of what had been done. The institutional machinery that had demanded their separation would never permit their return, regardless of legal outcomes. Laura's statement was even more heartbreaking in its simplicity. "We miss our mother and pray that she knows how much we love her." 7 words that contained more emotional truth than all the carefully crafted palace statements combined. 7 words that would haunt Camilla's dreams and torment her waking hours for years to come. That night, alone in her private quarters while Charles attended emergency meetings with senior government officials, she found herself drafting letters that could never be sent. Words of explanation, apology, and love that would remain forever undelivered because institutional necessity prohibited any acknowledgement of ongoing maternal feeling. The letters piled up on her desk like evidence of a crime, each one representing another failure to bridge the gap between public duty and private devotion. She wrote to Tom about his childhood fears and dreams, to Laura about their shared love of art and literature, to both of them about the pride she felt watching them grow into adults despite the complications of their unusual family circumstances. But every word was contraband, every sentence a potential violation of the constitutional separation that had been established to protect the crown from association with criminal investigation. Even private maternal love had become a threat to institutional stability. The morning brought news that would make the separation permanent and irreversible. Tom had been formally charged with money laundering and conspiracy to defraud, while Laura faced charges related to the art dealer's criminal network. The legal proceedings would likely continue for years, during which any contact with them would be seen as evidence of royal interference with justice. Sir Clive Alderton delivered the news with the same professional detachment that had characterized all their interactions during the crisis. The charges were serious enough to carry significant prison sentences if convictions were obtained, transforming her children from embarrassing relatives into actual criminals in the eyes of the law. The Attorney General wants to ensure that there can be no suggestion of royal privilege influencing the proceedings, he explained as he outlined new protocols for maintaining constitutional separation. Any contact, direct or indirect, could be construed as improper interference. Improper interference. Even a mother's love had been redefined as potential corruption of legal process, her natural desire to support her children transformed into constitutional liability that threatened the monarchy's credibility. The palace statement announcing the charges was brief and devastating in its clinical detachment. The royal family notes the serious charges brought against private individuals and reaffirms its commitment to the rule of law and proper legal processes. Private individuals. Her own children had been reduced to strangers whose only connection to her was through unfortunate accident of birth that must never again be officially acknowledged. The transformation was complete. She had become the queen consort who chose duty over family, institutional loyalty over maternal love. Standing before her window, overlooking the palace gardens where she had once imagined her grandchildren playing, Camilla finally understood the true cost of wearing the crown. It was not the loss of privacy or the burden of public scrutiny that extracted the highest price, but the gradual erosion of everything that made life worth living. The crown had survived another crisis by demanding the ultimate sacrifice from those who served it. And she had collapsed, not in front of the palace guards as the title suggested, but internally, in ways that no ceremony or protocol could address. The woman who had once fought so fiercely for her right to love Charles had learned that the monarchy she had joined demanded the surrender of every other love in return. The guards at their posts outside continued their eternal watch, protecting an institution that preserved itself by consuming the humanity of those who served it most faithfully.